Welcome back. At the Centre for Economic Policy Research, we bring you the most important new research on the economic impact of COVID-19. My name's TIm Phillips. Well, in the UK this week, non-essential shops are opening after 3 months, and there's going to be restaurants, bars and offices opening as well. But are policymakers making the right decisions? A paper from the Institute for Fiscal Studies that we published in issue 16 of COVID Economics examines the empirical evidence behind lockdown easing in the UK. And two of the authors join me today. Monica Costa, welcome.
Hi, Tim.
And Rob Joyce, welcome as well.
Thank you. Hi, Tim.
Now, Rob, I'll start with you. There is huge uncertainty around this empirical evidence, isn't there? And that itself might discourage businesses from taking important decisions. Is that bad news for the recovery?
Yes, I mean, economic uncertainty now is so pervasive. There's so much uncertainty about almost everything. On at least some measures, it's far greater now than any uncertainty we had during even the last Great Recession of the late 2000s. That is a real problem, particularly given that here, I think really one of the fundamental challenges we face is innovation. You know, almost by definition, with social distancing around, if people are going to be in work, in many cases that relies on them or their workplaces having adapted in some way to the new environment. So that requires innovation of one kind or another, not necessarily moving to the frontier of human knowledge, but at the level of any individual firm or workplace, it will often require them to be adapting, to be organising their workplaces differently. That will often be costly. If firms and workers don't know things like for how long they will have to do that, or what will happen if they don't do that, then it's much harder for them to be able to weigh up the pros and cons of making investments and trying to adapt in those ways. Similarly, for whether or not people should be working from home, you know, if people don't know for how long they should or will be encouraged to work from home, then they and their firms, you know, it's harder for them to weigh up whether it's worth investing in the kinds of technology and practices that will enable that for a long period or not. So I think it's always damaging, uncertainty. And I think in an environment where, you know, even in the short term, never mind the recovery, in an environment where kind of innovation is fundamental to getting the economy up and running again in many parts, I think the effect of uncertainty is perhaps even more of a drag in that context.
Monica, businesses and government both have to act. They both have to take decisions. How important is it that they coordinate in this?
So I think we think that is very important. In particular, governments can both do what they can to incentivize investments that are needed so that firms can continue to work as possible or restart working as soon as possible after this crisis. That these are the right kind of investments, and also to create the conditions under which these investments are the most productive, which is again another way of incentivizing them. So for instance, if some sectors must bring some of their workers into the workplace, the government should think about whether traveling for these workers is safe and what it can do to make it safer. Also, for instance, if public investments are needed now to support new technologies to work from home, for instance, this might be the right time to do these investments, for instance, in telecommunications. And in particular, I think in some areas, it's clear that, you know, there's going to be some mismatch between the skills that the workers that now are losing their jobs and the skills that firms are looking for the very few jobs that are becoming available. And so, again, government can think about ways of maybe retraining the workers that are now out of work to fill these vacancies and minimize the shock of these crises for them. So, you know, policies around job creation, facilitating the matching of workers to firms will be essentially important at this stage as we try to move out of the lockdown.
There is also a behavioural impact of all the policy innovations and the decisions that firms take. It sometimes seems that we're learning about this as we go along. Is that really true?
It is very early days for us to talk about behavioral impacts yet. We don't really have the data to see whether they are there, but we suspect, that many factors will influence actually the responses of agents to these measures. For instance, the new reform to the job retention scheme in the UK, which allows furloughed workers to go back into part-time work and retain part of the subsidy, is likely to have some behavioral consequences. So it may help, in particular with families with children who are struggling with the demands of taking care of their children at home while schools remain closed. But it, for instance, may be much less helpful for workers with underlying health conditions who are particularly vulnerable to the virus and who cannot work from home. So some of these individuals will start behaving potentially, some of the other individuals, with some of the other workers, with the ease of these measures, we may start behaving less carefully outside the home and make things actually more difficult for those who are more vulnerable for health reasons. So how these responses will play out, it's going to be crucial to understand exactly what the impacts of these policies are going to be. But of course, there is likely to be quite substantial moral hazard sort of issues where agents behave in some ways that are optimal for themselves and in response to the policy, but not necessarily optimally socially. These have been much less discussed with relation to the policies that have now been implemented, but we'll gain, we are sure, some more attention as we move forward.
Well, let's focus on what we do know, because there's quite a lot of it in your paper, actually. Rob, who hasn't been working over the last 3 months, and are they concentrated in particular sectors?
Yeah, well, first of all, a lot of people haven't been working. The latest figures we have on the number of people who have been furloughed, so that's people who still have an employment relationship with their employer but have not been working, that's got up to about 9 million. Now, that doesn't mean that all of those 9 million people have been furloughed the whole time. That's a number of people who have at some point been furloughed, but that gives you a sense of scale. So we're talking about something like roughly a third of all employees there. And that we know as well that plenty of people have been taking up the self-employed kind of grant scheme, which suggests that a number of them have seen a big drop off in work as well. Now, who are those people? So there's a couple of different elements that come into this when we're thinking about who's most likely to be in this situation without work. One is obviously some sectors have been shut down by decree, really, things like hospitality and accommodation and food, and non-food retail, at least until recently. So they account for a very disproportionate amount of the furloughing. I think around half actually is just coming from hospitality and from non-food retail. Who are the kinds of workers that are most likely to be in those kinds of sectors? They tend to be pretty low paid, and they are relatively low paying sectors. There are also other characteristics that a lot of those workers share. Being young is one. About a third of workers under 25 work in one of those shutdown sectors. So being young, being low paid are pretty good predictors of being in those kinds of sectors. Of course, there are other factors too. So even if you're in a different sector, at least until relatively recently, as some restrictions have been eased a little, whether or not your occupation was such that you could do it from home was a key factor as well. And that's some people are more likely to be able to do their job from home than others, something that we might come back to. Again, it tends to be people at the higher end, actually, on average, who are in occupations where they can be done from home. So yeah, we've seen a very, very large scale of people losing work, and it has tended to be correlated with being on low pay and being young. Will probably be the two biggest disparities there.
Rob, tell me a little bit more about the people that have been working from home and who are likely to be working from home in the long term. Also, do they tend to be situated around, for example, London and the southeast?
Yes, if we look at, so first of all, I should say this is quite difficult because when we're trying to think about who can work from home, it's difficult to be super precise, of course. What we tend to be doing is looking at the occupation level, and we tend to be looking at pre-crisis data. And we tend to be looking either at the number of people in occupations before the crisis who said that they could work from home. We have some information about that, and to get a sense of which occupations can more easily be done from home. Or we tend to be using information that we have on the task content of different occupations, which can tell us a little bit about how easy it would be to do those tasks remotely. But in either case, adaptations are possible. And so what looks to be the case based on sort of pre-crisis data, pre-crisis measures of task content, these things can be malleable. Jobs can adapt, and things can be done from home with enough adaptation in some cases. Not all, of course. If you're a truck driver, you probably can't work from home. But with those caveats in mind, we can look at where these occupations are, who has them, that seem to be more amenable to home working. And the answer we get is, A, as I've already said, it does tend to be higher paying occupations. B, if we look across the country broadly, there is a pattern there. Actually, people in London and the South East, again, because of the occupations they're in, it seems like they're more likely to be able to do their work from home. And we might come back to that, because that's relevant in other areas too, in other areas of the problem here. For example, if we're thinking about London, it might actually be quite useful that a lot of people there can work from home, because if they don't work from home, they'll tend to be commuting on public transport, which from the point of view of virus transmission is obviously a concern.
Yeah, Monica, I was going to ask you about that. For everyone who can't work from home, we've got to find out a way of getting them from their home to their workplace. And a lot of people are worrying about taking public transport at the moment. Having the rush hour that we used to have is really not an option, at least in the medium term. So how can policy help with this? What can we do?
Yes, so actually, as Rob mentioned, we see that the use of public transportation is particularly high in big cities, in particularly in London, and it's very concentrated at specific times of the day. So early in the morning and later in the afternoon, when people tend to commute to work. So it's a good coincidence to some extent that it's in these places that it's more feasible that women work from home, or a higher proportion of the population can actually work from home, and these should be incentivized to actually continue working from home, to allow others to use public transports in a safer way. But also, scattering the use of public transport throughout the day can also reduce the traffic in the most heavily used hours. And this could be possible, for instance, by incentivizing firms and workers to relax their work schedules and move workers who need to travel to do part-time shifts and scatter these part-time shifts around the day, so that they are not as concentrated as they used to be prior to the crisis. Now, there are other measures that could be taken, for instance, like incentives to cycle and to work, to walk to work where possible. This should be considered. This will have, the advantages of not only reducing demand for public transportation during the peak hours, but also bring in additional health and environmental benefits that we may want to consider.
Rob, once people get to work, they've got to expect a safe workplace. Of course, there are clear incentives for employers to provide a safe workplace, but is that going to be enough on its own, or will the government have to do a bit of arm twisting?
Yeah, so I mean, economically, there's the potential issue here, of course, of externalities, which is that part of the benefits of having a safe workplace flow to society at large, because it's something that can reduce the rate at which the virus is transmitted. And so we always might worry in that kind of situation that the private incentives to do this won't be enough. They won't be sharp enough. And that sort of situation arises all over the place here when we've got a contagious virus around, and this is an example of that. Now, I mean, we are talking at the moment about fairly clear, I mean, the details are obviously always quite murky about exactly what firms should and shouldn't be doing, but the direction of the basic point is clear to them, which is that they are expected to take measures. We need to keep a certain distance apart, and that you are breaking the law if you don't take some steps to do that. So you might think that's kind of enough. At the moment, though, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that there is still the furlough scheme in operation. So firms can choose not to come back to work at all for the time being, and still get much of their workers' costs paid for. So there is, one of the unavoidable, frankly, trade-offs with something like the furlough scheme, which is there to try to insure firms and workers against what's happening at the moment, is that it does dampen the incentive to innovate, to get people back to work. If it's costly to do innovations that would keep your workplace safer, the fact that you can instead not do that and for the time being get much of your workers' salaries paid for is, it will dampen the incentive to get people back to work and make the adjustments needed to the workplace. So that may still be, there may still be an incentive issue there, and that firms kind of underinvest in this. Now, the furlough scheme is going to be wound down soon. It's going to start being wound down from August. And there are obviously huge kind of risks to that in terms of what we see happening to unemployment and so on. But one of the side effects will be that we will no longer, through that means, be kind of disincentivizing firms from making innovations and adaptations to make their workplaces safe and practicable to work in. So perhaps at that point, the concern will more be one about making sure that the rules are properly enforced and monitored, and that the guidance is as clear as it can be to ensure that firms do what we want them to do.
Do we know how many people are going to be excluded from the workforce post-COVID, either because, well, they might be unwilling to go back to work, or they might be prevented from going back to work because it's unsafe for them? Monica, what do we know about that?
So we know something, not every, we don't obviously have all the information that we would like, but so for instance, we know, for instance, that some people are going to be particularly vulnerable because of health reasons, and may find it impossible to return to work if they have to come back into the workplace. Now, we don't know how many these are because we have relatively little information about the distribution of health conditions and how they relate to COVID. But we can actually look into other aspects of people's lives. So for instance, we know the age distribution of the population, and in particular of the population of workers, and we know that people who are older are much more vulnerable to COVID, and in particular to the worst manifestations of this disease than younger people. And so if we exclude key workers who in principle continue to work, or at least the vast majority of them continue to work, those who are older than 60 or live with someone in that age group, and so carry the risk of transmitting the virus to their family members, represent almost 20% of the population of workers. There are obviously other constraints that some workers may face. Again, those who are not key workers. So if we add these up, such as living with a key worker or having young children who are school or preschool age, then this amounts to almost 60% of the population, and is actually higher in London than elsewhere.
Rob, there is also this thing that economists call labour market adjustment, isn't it? Which basically means some jobs are not going to exist, and some places are going to be much harder hit with unemployment, some sectors much harder hit with unemployment than others. What do we know about the pattern for this, and what policy can do to offset it?
Well, this is, I think, going to be a real challenge over the next months and possibly years, because just the scale of the disruption that's all happened at the same time is so severe and unusually so, and with, at least for some period of time, basically whole sectors not being able to operate. Of course, one key issue which is still very uncertain is how persistent some of these effects will be on the overall mix of economic activity, and therefore where the jobs are. We don't yet know the extent to which parts of the retail sector, the airline industry, say, will bounce back, or whether this will be a permanent shift, the extent to which consumer habits will change permanently in terms of shifting to e-commerce and things like that. These are all unanswered questions, and that will obviously affect in the long run just how much reallocation of labour we will end up needing from sectors which people used to work in to sectors that will be bigger in the future. But even ignoring some of those bigger long-term questions, it's clear that at least for a considerable period, we've had a big shift in the kinds of economic activities that we're doing, and a lot of people who have been displaced from their previous work and will need to find new work, whether that's in a new sector or in something more similar to what they did before, if there are jobs available there. So there's a huge amount of just sorting out for the labour market to do at the same time. We're going to have lots of workers looking for work at the same time. Probably quite a lot of new firms at some point will be starting up if lots have been destroyed during the crisis. Certainly firms will be perhaps kind of at some point rehiring. It can take the labour market a long time just for all those matches to be made. We've seen some anecdotal kind of examples of how this can be a rather slow and painful process recently already, in the case of fruit pickers, where clearly there are people on some level who are available to do work. There's lots of people not doing productive work right now, and yet it took fruit picking the fruit picking sector a long time, it seemed, to fill vacancies, because there was just no coordination. You have lots of small employers trying to find lots of workers, and it just took a long time. And something like that on a much bigger scale across the whole economy could be a real issue. It could mean that it takes much longer for us to adjust than it should do, and for people to find work than they should do. Now, there's layered on top of that, there's the issue of skills, and there's the issue of, are the skill sets of people looking for work who have been displaced on some level in their previous work going to match up well with the skill requirements of jobs that are popping up? And there's no guarantee in any given local area that will be the case. And so there we have a challenge again for labour market policy, potentially, of can we help and facilitate good training or retraining to enable people to be able to take up opportunities that do exist. And I suppose more generally for the future, do we want to think about having a labour market that just can be more nimble and resilient to shocks of this kind, or even of a different kind, just generally to the possibility that something will happen which changes the kinds of skills that people need after they've already been through the education system? And can we build a system which is a little bit more resilient to that and enables people to adjust?
Now, last brief question for both of you. Should we have learnt from the policies that were put in place in the recovery from the last crisis not so long ago? Monica?
So I think what we have seen since the last crisis is that labour productivity in the UK was badly affected by the crisis, and then really never recovered ever since. So clearly there has been some lack of investment in what could have meant that the labour productivity would pick up. It did actually in other countries here in the UK, and so it was essentially becoming really obvious even before the crisis that some sectors were struggling, such as, for instance, retail and aviation. We would expect that sooner or later it will start struggling as well, given the environmental concerns that have been raised. And so identifying now the most promising industries, differently from what was done before, and prioritizing policies that actually promote development of these industries, I think is going to be one major challenge for policy.
Rob, what do you think that we should have learned from the last crisis?
I was just going to make, because in addition to Monica's, I think absolutely correct specific points, just a general remark on this, which was that one of maybe the most striking and perhaps unusual feature of the last crisis is how long the shadow it was that it cast. We were still, as we came into this crisis, really paying the cost of the previous one, in that income growth was still very, very, very poor. For example, for the bottom fifth of households, they'd seen no income growth actually in the 5 years leading up to the crisis. We'd had a decade of austerity and cuts to the welfare system, which meant that the level of insurance that was there for many households against a shock like the one we've now had was lower than it would otherwise have been, and all very much related to the fact that it took us so long to recover from the last recession. And so, really, I think it does just go to show how important it is to get a quick recovery, which involves productivity and therefore earnings growth bouncing back as quickly as possible. For whatever reason, I think it's still not fully understood. We did that really, really badly after the last crisis. There's this well-known productivity puzzle, which is basically the fact that the UK, not only did it take a hit in productivity when the crisis hit, but the productivity barely grew again at all over the following decade or so, and we fell behind all of our international competitors over that period. And there's been a lot of work on that, but I think we still don't fully understand it, to be honest. But anything that we can do to avoid that long shadow, as it were, coming out of this next crisis could be key, because otherwise we could easily have another crisis before we've recovered from this one.
If I can just add, given that Rob gave me the lead, one issue that was obvious as we came into this crisis and that required a lot of legislation to make up for was that the type of policy changes that occurred before and after the previous crisis removed automatic stabilizers essentially from the policy set. And these were required, for instance, in terms of the furlough scheme that was introduced to protect firms and workers against this huge shock. There were no protections really that were proportional to the incomes that workers in particular had before the crisis. And so rethinking how to do policy in a more permanent way that can actually, work both in periods of expansion, but in particular in periods of the recession is very important.
So Monica, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
And Rob, thank you as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Now, I've worked both of my guests today so hard, you might be thinking, could there possibly be any more in this paper? Well, actually there is. There's quite a lot more. So I would really recommend reading it. It's in issue 16 of COVID Economics, and it's called Getting People Back into Work. The authors are Monica Costa Diaz, Christine Farquharson, Rachel Griffith, Robert Joyce, and Peter Lavelle. So go along to the VoxEU website, download it, have a look. While you're there, have a look at all the other material we've got there. We're adding to it every day. And so every time you come back, there is something new about COVID-19. Meanwhile, though, from Rob and Monica and myself, everyone else at the CEPR, we'll see you soon. And as we always say at this point, stay positive by staying negative.